The dog had followed every command for 10 years, until the day he refused to move. Daniel Hayes stopped halfway down the narrow canyon trail, boots crunching against fresh snow while cold mountain wind rushed through the pines like something whispering from far away. Colorado winters carried a strange silence. Not peaceful silence. The kind that made people feel watched even when nobody stood nearby. Shadow never liked stopping during hikes. The German Shepherd had military discipline burned into him long ago. Move. Observe. Stay alert. But never freeze without reason. Yet there he stood now. Motionless. Ears stiff. Muscles tight beneath his black and tan coat. Eyes locked toward the edge of a narrow rock formation 30 feet ahead. Daniel adjusted the strap of his backpack and frowned. "Come on, buddy," he said calmly. "Sun is dropping." Nothing. Shadow did not even turn his head. The dog only stood there, breathing slowly into the cold air while snow gathered lightly across his back. Daniel sighed quietly. It had been almost 7 years since retirement. 7 years since the Marine Corps stopped calling. 7 years since long nights stopped sounding like helicopters and radio static inside his head. Yet somehow, life still felt unfinished. Especially after divorce. Especially after too much silence inside a cabin built for more than one person. Shadow changed that. Dogs had a strange way of keeping lonely people honest. Even on the worst days, they still expected you to wake up. Still expected food. Movement. Life. Maybe that was why Daniel trusted Shadow more than most people. The dog survived Afghanistan beside him. Explosions. Dust storms. Nights nobody talked about afterward. More than once, Shadow noticed danger before humans ever could. That kind of trust never really disappeared. Which was exactly why this moment felt wrong. Daniel stepped closer. "Shadow," he repeated, firmer this time. "Heel." Still nothing. The German Shepherd shifted slightly, but remained planted near the rocky overlook, staring downward into the canyon below, like something invisible waited there. Wind pushed harder now, the sky turning darker shades of gray. Snow coming faster. Daniel moved beside him carefully and followed the dog's line of sight. Nothing obvious. Just jagged rocks. Pine trees buried beneath patches of ice. Deep canyon shadows stretching farther than daylight could reach. Empty. Or at least it looked empty. Shadow suddenly let out a low sound. Not a bark. Not fear. Something quieter. Uneasy. Daniel felt his chest tighten slightly. In 10 years, he learned Shadow communicated differently than ordinary dogs. Small movements mattered. A shift in breathing. Posture. Eye contact. Military K9s were trained to observe first, react second. And right now? Shadow looked disturbed. "What are you seeing?" Daniel muttered quietly. The dog stepped forward suddenly, then stopped again near a narrow opening between large rock walls half covered by snow. Hidden enough most hikers would never notice. Daniel narrowed his eyes. Strange place. No marked trail nearby. Nobody camped here in winter. Nobody sane anyway. "You smell something?" he asked. Shadow looked back at him briefly, then back toward the canyon. Same movement twice. Intentional. Daniel hated admitting it, but something about the whole thing made the hairs rise slightly along the back of his neck. He reached into his jacket and checked his phone. No signal. Typical. The deeper parts of these mountains rarely offered much help if things went wrong. 5 minutes, he said quietly. Then we go home. Shadow moved first. Slow. Careful. The German Shepherd stepped toward the narrow path between rocks, while Daniel followed reluctantly behind. Snow crunched under boots. Wind disappeared strangely between canyon walls until everything suddenly felt too quiet. Even birds seemed gone here. After about 40 yards, Daniel stopped abruptly. Something small lay half-buried near the rocks. Bright against the snow. He bent slowly and picked it up. Tiny fabric. Faded pink. A child's mitten. Old. Weathered. But not ancient. Daniel turned it over silently. Strange place for something like this. Families did not hike here. Especially not in winter. Probably washed down, he muttered to himself. But even he did not sound convinced. Shadow moved farther ahead and stopped again near the edge of another rock shelf. This time the dog refused to budge completely. Ears forward. Breathing harder now. Daniel stepped beside him carefully. Then noticed something else. Small scratch marks near the stone. Faint signs someone moved through here before. Human? Animal? Hard to tell. Wind erased things fast in the canyon. Daniel looked toward the fading daylight overhead. Too late to explore deeper. Too risky. Mountains punished bad timing. Tomorrow, he said quietly. We come back tomorrow. He reached gently toward Shadow's collar. But the German shepherd resisted. Barely. Just enough to make a point. Daniel froze. Because in 10 years, Shadow never ignored command. Not once. Not during storms. Not during fear. Not even during war. The dog looked back toward him then. Amber eyes sharp. Focused. Waiting. Like he wanted Daniel to understand something words could never explain. Then came the sound. Faint. So faint Daniel almost missed it completely beneath the wind. Something distant. Small. Like movement carried through rock. He turned immediately toward the canyon shadows. Silence again. Just snow. Just cold. Yet suddenly the canyon did not feel empty anymore. And for the first time in years, Daniel Hayes had the strange feeling that something down there had been waiting to be found. Daniel barely slept that night. The canyon stayed in his mind long after darkness swallowed the mountains outside his cabin windows. Strange how silence sometimes grew louder after something felt wrong. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw a shadow standing frozen beside the rocks, refusing command for the first time in 10 years. That alone unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Military dogs did not ignore training without reason. Especially not Shadow. Around 5:30 the next morning, pale winter light slowly stretched across the mountains while snow rested thick over the trees outside. Daniel stood in the kitchen holding black coffee, staring through the window while Shadow sat unusually still beside the front door. Waiting. Focused. Like he already knew where they were going. No excitement. No pacing. Just patience. That somehow made everything feel stranger. You really want to go back, Daniel muttered quietly. Shadow lifted his head immediately. One sharp look. Ears forward. Daniel exhaled slowly. Yeah, he said after a pause. I know. 30 minutes later, the old pickup truck climbed the winding mountain road toward the canyon again. Gray sky above. Fresh snow beneath the tires. The kind of cold that settled deep into bones if you stayed outside too long. Shadow sat upright in the passenger seat the entire drive, watching the road with unusual intensity. Not nervous. Focused. That bothered Daniel too. Focused usually meant purpose. And purpose usually meant something real. The canyon looked colder in daylight. Larger somehow. Wind cut sharply between stone walls while pine branches bent beneath heavy snow. Daniel adjusted his backpack, checked supplies, and looked toward Shadow. Same rules, he said calmly. We look around. We stay smart. We do not do anything reckless. Shadow was already moving before the sentence finished. Straight toward the same narrow opening between rocks from yesterday. No hesitation. No confusion. Like he remembered exactly where something waited. Daniel followed quietly behind, boots sinking into fresh snow while cold air sharpened every sound around them. The strange thing about empty places? They never actually felt empty when something was wrong. About 40 yards in, Shadow stopped near yesterday's overlook again, then immediately moved farther down the narrow trail Daniel almost missed before. Hidden. Small enough most people would walk straight past it. Daniel frowned. I did not even see this yesterday, he muttered. The German shepherd paused briefly, glancing back like impatient approval before continuing deeper into the canyon. 10 minutes later, Daniel stopped again near a cluster of rocks partially buried beneath snow. Something bright caught his eye. Plastic. He bent down carefully and brushed away ice. A faded juice pouch. Old but not ancient. Children's brand. Strange place for trash. Stranger because it looked protected from weather. Nearby sat another thing. Tiny shoe print. Small. Faint but visible beneath partially frozen dirt. Daniel froze. Children did not hike alone this deep into the canyon. Not during winter. Not anywhere near these cliffs. His chest tightened slightly. What exactly are you trying to show me? He asked quietly. Shadow moved ahead again, slower now. More cautious. Nose close to the ground. Ears twitching at every sound. Then suddenly, the dog stopped hard near a rock wall covered partly by fallen branches. Not natural branches either. Arranged strangely. Like someone placed them there intentionally. Daniel stepped closer carefully. Wind disappeared almost completely here. Too quiet again. The kind of silence that made every breath feel too loud. Shadow let out another low, uneasy sound before nudging the branches lightly with his nose. Daniel crouched slowly. Something about the shape looked wrong. Too deliberate. He moved several branches aside carefully and paused. Behind them sat a narrow opening in the rock. Small. Hidden. barely noticeable unless somebody stood directly in front of it. His pulse slowed the strange way adrenaline sometimes worked. Calm first. Questions second. No way, he whispered quietly. Then came the sound again. Faint. So faint he almost convinced himself it was only wind. Movement. Maybe. Or breathing. Daniel leaned slightly closer. Silence. Then something small shifted deeper inside. Shadow immediately stood straighter, tail still, muscles tense, but not aggressive. Alert. Listening. Daniel swallowed once. Hello? He called carefully into the darkness. Nothing. Just canyon echoes. He tried again. Anybody in there? Still silence. Then suddenly, so soft he almost missed it, something moved deeper beyond the rocks. Small. Fast. Human? Animal? Impossible to tell. Daniel stepped back instinctively. Heart beating harder now. None of this felt normal anymore. Lost supplies. Child-sized footprint. Hidden opening. Sounds inside a canyon nobody visited. Something lived here. Or someone. Before Daniel could decide what to do next, Shadow suddenly sat beside the opening and refused to move again. Same posture as yesterday. Same determination. Like the dog had already made up his mind hours ago. Daniel stared at him for several seconds before shaking his head slowly. You are not letting this go, are you? Shadow looked toward the opening again. Then back at Daniel. Quiet. Certain. And somehow, Daniel had the uncomfortable feeling the dog already knew something he had not figured out yet. Before we keep going, make sure to press like and subscribe so you do not miss more incredible stories like this one. Because deep in the Colorado Canyon, Daniel Hayes was starting to realize he had not returned to the mountains to find answers. Something in the canyon might have been waiting for someone to finally listen. Daniel did not go inside the hidden opening. Not yet. Mountains punished rushed decisions. Years in the Marines had taught him one thing better than courage ever could. Slow people survived longer. Smart people noticed details. And right now, details felt wrong everywhere he looked. The narrow entrance hidden behind branches stayed quiet after the strange sound disappeared. Too quiet. Shadow remained seated directly in front of it, perfectly still, watching the darkness like something inside mattered more than comfort or weather. Snow drifted slowly between the canyon walls, while fading daylight reminded Daniel they had already stayed longer than planned. We are coming back prepared, he said quietly. Tomorrow. Shadow did not move. Daniel sighed softly and crouched beside him. Buddy, he said gently. I hear you. But freezing out here helps nobody. After several long seconds, the German shepherd finally stood, reluctant but obedient enough to follow Daniel back through the canyon. Yet, twice during the walk back, Shadow stopped and looked over his shoulder, watching the hidden trail, waiting, like part of him wanted to stay behind. The drive back toward town felt strangely heavier than usual. Snow covered the roads in thick gray slush, while low clouds pressed down over the mountains. Daniel barely touched the coffee he bought from a roadside gas station because his mind kept replaying everything. The mitten, the footprint, the hidden entrance, and that sound. Something moved inside that canyon. He felt sure of it now. But what? Lost hikers? Runaways? Wildlife? Nothing made sense. By late afternoon, Daniel pulled into the small mountain town of Cedar Ridge, population barely over 2,000. Quiet place. One diner. One grocery store. One gas station. The kind of town where everybody noticed strangers, but nobody asked too many questions after winter started. He parked outside the diner mostly because hot food sounded easier than thinking. Inside, warm air and the smell of coffee hit immediately. A few locals sat near the windows watching snow gather outside, while an old country song played softly from overhead speakers. Shadow stayed close beside him, unusually alert even indoors. That caught Daniel's attention too. The dog normally relaxed once inside buildings. Today he kept watching the windows. Watching people. Watching the door. Strange. Daniel slid into a booth near the back, while a waitress with silver hair poured coffee without asking. Storm's getting worse, she said kindly. You hiking in this weather? Daniel nodded once. Up near Raven Canyon. The woman paused. Small pause, but enough to notice. Not many people go there anymore, she said carefully before walking off. Daniel frowned slightly. Small towns had tells. Silence usually meant history. While waiting for food, he noticed something near the front counter pinned beside faded local flyers. Missing posters. Old ones. Most yellowed with time. One stood out immediately. Two smiling girls. Same last name. Same photo frame. Daniel stood slowly and walked closer. Missing since, for years ago. Emily Parker, age 10. Sophie Parker, age 8. Last seen near hiking trails outside Cedar Ridge. Reward expired years earlier. Daniel stared longer than necessary. Both girls had bright winter jackets in the photograph. One pink, one blue. Then something tightened quietly inside his chest. Pink mitten. He looked closer. Emily's jacket. Pink gloves. Daniel swallowed once. No way. No possible way. For years, nobody survived 4 Colorado winters inside canyon country. Yet something about the thought refused to leave him alone. The waitress returned carrying food and noticed where he stood. Her expression changed immediately. Softer somehow. Sadder. Most people stopped looking after the second year, she said quietly. Daniel turned toward her. What happened? She hesitated. Girls vanished during a camping trip with family friends, she explained. Search teams looked everywhere. Her voice lowered slightly. Nobody ever found anything. Daniel glanced toward the photographs again. Raven Canyon? The woman paused too long. People said maybe, she admitted carefully. But weather got bad. Terrain dangerous. Search ended. Strange thing about grief. Towns learn how to bury it. Pretend enough time somehow made hard things disappear. Daniel returned to the booth slowly while Shadow sat unusually close beside him now, eyes locked toward the poster wall. Daniel looked down at the dog carefully. You smelled something, he said quietly. Shadow blinked once. Calm. Focused. Waiting. Then something even stranger happened. The older man sitting in the booth behind Daniel suddenly leaned forward slightly. You stay away from Raven Canyon, he muttered quietly without making eye contact. Daniel turned. Why? The man stared into his coffee. Some places, he said softly, want to stay forgotten. No explanation after that. Just silence. He stood, paid his bill, and left without another word. Outside, snow continued falling harder. Daniel sat inside the truck afterward longer than necessary, while Shadow watched the road through the windshield. 2 missing girls. For years gone. Hidden canyon opening. Strange sounds. Fear from locals. None of it felt random anymore. Then Daniel looked again at the faded missing poster folded carefully beside him on the passenger seat, and quietly said something he had not expected to mean. We are going back tomorrow. Shadow immediately lifted his head. Ears forward. Ready. Like the dog had been waiting for Daniel to finally understand. Daniel woke before sunrise. Not because of habit this time. Because something felt unfinished. Snow pressed softly against the cabin windows while cold blue morning light barely touched the kitchen floor. The mountains outside looked frozen in place. Quiet. Too quiet. Yet for the first time in years, silence no longer felt empty. It felt expectant. Shadow stood beside the front door before Daniel even reached for coffee. Alert already. Watching him. Waiting. Same posture as yesterday. Same focus. Like the dog had spent the entire night thinking about the canyon too. Yeah. Daniel said quietly while pulling on his boots. We are going. 40 minutes later, they reached Raven Canyon again. Fresh snow covered yesterday's tracks, erasing almost every sign they had left behind. But Shadow did not hesitate for even a second. The German shepherd moved with certainty through the narrow canyon trail, nose low, muscles tense, leading Daniel back toward the hidden opening behind the branches. Wind pushed hard through the upper cliffs, but strangely, the deeper they walked, the quieter everything became. Almost like the canyon swallowed sound. Daniel adjusted the flashlight clipped to his jacket and slowed near the hidden entrance. Same branches. Same narrow opening in the rock wall. Same uneasy feeling pressing low in his chest. Shadow stopped directly in front of it again. Waiting. Watching. Daniel crouched carefully and moved more branches aside. The opening looked slightly wider in daylight. Just enough space for someone to move through sideways if they tried. Cold air drifted outward. Not normal canyon cold. Different somehow. Stale. Closed in. Human. Daniel hesitated for half a second before speaking softly into the darkness. Hello. Silence. Then movement. Quick. Almost invisible. Shadow stood immediately, ears forward. Tail still. Focus sharp. Daniel switched on the flashlight and stepped closer. We are not here to hurt anybody, he said calmly. If somebody is down there, I can help. Nothing. Just darkness stretching deeper than expected. Then suddenly, soft footsteps. Tiny footsteps. Daniel froze completely. Not animal movement. Human. Small human movement. Slow. Careful. Then a shape appeared farther inside. Small. Thin. Almost hidden in shadows. Daniel lowered himself slightly, trying not to appear threatening. A face emerged briefly. Young. Pale. Wide frightened eyes. Then gone again. Fast. Like somebody disappearing into darkness. Daniel stopped breathing for a second. No. No way. Impossible. For years, nobody survived 4 winters out here. Nobody. Yet his instincts screamed something different. Shadow let out the quietest sound Daniel had heard from him in days. Soft. Gentle. Not alert anymore. Familiar somehow. Comforting. Then something happened Daniel would never forget. Another smaller figure stepped partly into view farther back. Younger. Thin winter coat, too large for her frame. Hesitant eyes locked onto Shadow. The dog slowly sat down. Calm. Still. No sudden movement. Military discipline wrapped inside patience. The younger girl stared at him for several long seconds. Then, unbelievably, took one small step forward. Daniel felt his pulse climbing. Hey, he said quietly. You are okay. No answer. Only silence. Fear. The older girl stepped protectively in front of the younger one immediately. Smart. Defensive. Like somebody used to surviving without trust. Daniel recognized the look instantly. Trauma changed posture long before words. My name is Daniel, he said carefully. This is Shadow. The younger girl's eyes never left the German Shepherd. Something softened slightly in her expression. Tiny, but noticeable. Then came the words, barely above a whisper. So quiet Daniel almost missed them. Dog. Daniel swallowed hard. Yeah, he said softly. He is friendly. Shadow stayed seated. Calm. No movement except steady breathing. Like somehow he understood fear needed space. Then the older girl finally spoke. Voice weak. Careful. You have to leave. Daniel frowned gently. Why? Her eyes shifted nervously toward the deeper darkness behind them. He comes back sometimes. Daniel's stomach tightened instantly. Not weather. Not survival accident. Somebody else knew about this place. Somebody real. Somebody recent. Who? He asked carefully. The older girl looked terrified the moment he asked. Too terrified. She shook her head quickly. You should go, she whispered again. Before he comes. Shadow suddenly stood and moved slightly closer to the girls. Slowly. Patiently. The younger girl hesitated only a moment before reaching trembling fingers toward his fur. The instant her hand touched the German Shepherd's neck, something changed. Her shoulders loosened. Just slightly. Like fear had finally made room for relief. Daniel felt something painful settle quietly in his chest. Because no child should look that relieved to touch something safe. Snow drifted softly outside the hidden opening while canyon shadows deepened around them. Daniel looked between the frightened girls and Shadow sitting calmly beside them. And for the first time since stepping into Raven Canyon, one truth became impossible to ignore. Somebody had not lost these girls 4 years ago. Somebody had hidden them. Daniel stayed exactly where he was. Slow breathing. Open posture. No sudden movement. Fear changed people, especially children. And whatever these girls had survived inside Raven Canyon had taught them one dangerous lesson already. Do not trust too quickly. Shadow understood before Daniel said a word. The German Shepherd lowered himself gently to the ground near the younger girl, calm as winter snow, allowing her small trembling hand to remain against his fur. For the first time since Daniel stepped into the hidden shelter, the fear in her eyes softened. Not gone, but quieter, safer. The older girl still stood protectively nearby, thin shoulders tense beneath an oversized coat that clearly did not belong to her. She looked older than the missing poster from the diner. Harder too, like childhood had quietly disappeared without asking permission. Daniel kept his voice steady. Soft. I am not here to hurt you, he said carefully. I just want to help. The older girl said nothing at first. Only watched him with tired eyes that looked far older than 14 should ever look. Then quietly, almost reluctantly, she spoke. You should leave before dark. Daniel frowned slightly. You said somebody comes back. Her jaw tightened immediately. Small reaction, but enough. Sometimes, she whispered. Not every day. Daniel's stomach turned. Somebody knew these girls were here. Somebody had been bringing food, keeping them hidden. Nothing about this felt accidental anymore. He carefully glanced deeper inside the narrow shelter. The space looked partially natural but altered. Blankets piled near the back wall. Small containers stacked neatly. Old lantern. Empty food wrappers. Too organized for survival alone. Somebody maintained this place. Somebody planned it. Daniel looked back toward the girls. Do you know your names? The younger one stayed close to Shadow now, fingers buried gently against the dog's neck. But the older girl answered quietly. Emily. Then motioning toward the younger child. Sophie. Daniel froze for half a second. Same names from the diner poster. For years missing. For years buried beneath silence while the entire town assumed tragedy had already won. Daniel swallowed slowly. Emily, he said gently. People have been looking for you. Emily shook her head immediately. No, she said quietly. They stopped. Those words landed harder than Daniel expected. Because somehow she sounded certain. Like disappointment had become routine. Sophie looked up finally, voice soft and uncertain. Did Mom send you? Daniel's chest tightened painfully. He crouched slightly lower. No, he answered honestly. But I know people who care about finding you. Sophie looked confused by the idea. Emily stepped closer immediately, protective again. You cannot tell, she whispered quickly. If he knows we talked, her voice disappeared. Fear replacing words again. Daniel recognized the look instantly. The kind of fear that came from experience, not imagination. Somebody had taught them consequences. Somebody they feared enough to protect, even in silence. Outside, snow drifted harder through the canyon entrance while afternoon light slowly faded. Winter moved quickly in Colorado. Too quickly. Daniel checked his watch. They could not stay here overnight. Not safely. Yet leaving felt impossible now. Emily, he said carefully. I need you to trust me a little. She looked uncertain. Suspicious. Exhausted. Fair reactions. I was a Marine, Daniel continued calmly. I spent years helping people get out of bad places. He motioned gently toward Shadow. And he has been helping people his whole life too. Sophie rested closer against the German shepherd now. Calm enough to breathe easier. Safe enough to stop shaking. Daniel noticed something then. Small bruising? No, not bruising. Just signs of harsh weather and long survival. Dry skin. Thin jackets. Tired eyes. Nothing graphic. Nothing alarming enough for panic. But enough to tell one quiet truth. Nobody had cared for these girls the way children deserved. Suddenly Shadow lifted his head sharply toward the canyon entrance. Alert again. Daniel turned immediately. Nothing visible yet. Just wind. But the dog's posture changed. Listening. Focused. Concerned. Daniel trusted that instinct without question. Did somebody tell you not to leave? He asked quickly. Emily hesitated too long. Then nodded once. Tiny movement. Almost invisible. He says people out there are dangerous, she whispered. Daniel looked toward Shadow again. The German shepherd remained fixed on the entrance now. Waiting. Listening. Daniel's military instincts stirred quietly awake. Something felt wrong. Timing maybe. Or instinct. Hard to explain. But years surviving dangerous situations had taught him one uncomfortable truth. Sometimes danger arrived quietly first. Then came understanding later. Daniel looked back toward Emily. Decision made. We are leaving together, he said gently but firmly. Emily shook her head immediately. Fear returning fast. No, she whispered. He will get angry. Daniel softened his tone. Nobody is going to hurt you. Then something happened that made the entire canyon suddenly feel colder. Outside, faint but unmistakable, came the distant sound of an engine somewhere far above the canyon road. Vehicle tires moving slowly through fresh snow. Shadow stood immediately. Silent. Focused. Ready. And for the first time since finding the girls, Daniel realized something terrifyingly simple. Whoever had hidden them here might already know somebody else had finally found them. Daniel moved fast, but not carelessly. Years in the Marines had taught him that panic solved nothing. Calm kept people alive. Shadow remained fixed near the entrance of the hidden shelter, body tense, ears raised, listening to the distant sound outside. The low hum of an engine drifted faintly through the canyon again before disappearing beneath the wind. Too close to ignore. Too slow to feel accidental. Daniel lowered his voice immediately. Emily, he said softly, I need you to listen carefully. Emily stood frozen, fear already spreading across her face while Sophie remained crouched beside Shadow, fingers gripping his fur like it was the only solid thing left in the world. How often does he come? Daniel asked. Emily hesitated. Sometimes every few days, she whispered. Sometimes longer. Her eyes shifted nervously toward the canyon entrance. He brings supplies. Daniel's jaw tightened quietly. Supplies meant planning. Planning meant intention. Whoever this person was had not forgotten about the girls. He had kept returning, which meant they had very little time if somebody suspected something changed. Daniel looked carefully around the shelter again. Small blankets, canned food, flashlights, containers stacked neatly. Too organized to be random, yet strangely incomplete too. No comfort, no warmth beyond survival. Like somebody had built just enough life to keep people hidden, not cared for. That unsettled him more than he expected. "Emily," he asked gently, "does he stay long?" She shook her head quickly. "No. He gets angry if we ask questions." Sophie lowered her eyes at those words. Small reaction, but enough to say fear lived here daily. Daniel crouched lower, keeping his tone calm. "You did nothing wrong," he said carefully. Emily looked uncertain, like she wanted to believe him, but had forgotten how trust worked. Shadow suddenly moved closer to Sophie again and gently rested against her shoulder. The younger girl immediately relaxed a little. Daniel noticed it right away. Dogs sometimes did what words could not. They reminded frightened people what safety felt like. Then came the sound again. Closer now. Not inside the canyon. Above it. A vehicle door shutting somewhere far off. Daniel looked toward Shadow instantly. The German shepherd remained silent, but his posture changed. Focused. Alert. Ready. That was enough for Daniel. "We are leaving," he said quietly but firmly. Emily stepped backward immediately, fear flashing across her face. "No," she whispered quickly. "If he finds out," Daniel softened his voice. "Listen to me." He paused carefully. "Nobody should live hidden in a canyon." Emily looked away. Silence stretched for several seconds before she whispered something, so quietly Daniel nearly missed it. Nobody came. Those words landed hard. Harder than anything else. Because she was not accusing him. She was telling the truth she had learned to survive with. Nobody came. Nobody found them. Nobody stayed searching long enough. Daniel nodded slowly. "You are right," he said gently. "Some people stopped looking." He glanced toward Shadow. But somebody did not. Sophie finally looked up. "The dog?" she asked quietly. Daniel gave the smallest nod. "Yeah," he said softly. He would not leave. Sophie reached down and wrapped both arms carefully around Shadow's neck. The German shepherd stayed perfectly still, patient, protective. Daniel felt something tighten quietly in his chest again. Nobody had taught these girls safety for years. Yet somehow, trust returned fastest through a dog. Outside, snow thickened harder now, daylight fading quicker across the canyon walls. Colorado winters moved fast after sunset, too fast to waste another hour. Daniel stood slowly and unzipped his backpack. "I brought food," he said gently. "Water too." Emily hesitated. Hunger showed briefly in her expression before caution returned. Daniel placed supplies near the blankets and stepped back intentionally. Space mattered. Choice mattered. Especially for scared kids. Shadow stayed beside Sophie while Emily carefully approached the food, cautious at first, like somebody waiting for permission. Daniel looked toward the canyon entrance again. Wind shifted suddenly. Then came another sound. Faint. Almost hidden beneath snow. Footsteps? No. Something moving higher up the rocks. Slow. Heavy enough to matter. Shadow stood immediately. Silent. Focused toward the entrance. Daniel felt every old survival instinct wake quietly inside him. Not fear. Awareness. The kind veterans carried long after war ended. Somebody could be nearby. Or maybe not. But instinct said, trust the dog. Always trust the dog. Daniel turned back toward the girls quickly. Decision made. "We leave now," he said. "No arguments." Emily looked terrified again. "He will know," she whispered. Daniel nodded once. Honest. Calm. "Maybe," he admitted. "But he does not get to decide what happens anymore." For the first time since meeting him, Emily looked uncertain in a different way. Not fear. Hope. Small. Fragile. Dangerous thing after years of disappointment. Sophie stood quietly beside Shadow and reached for Daniel's sleeve without saying anything. Tiny gesture, but enough. Trust beginning. Outside, canyon shadows stretched darker beneath falling snow, while somewhere beyond the cliffs, something unseen moved through the storm. Daniel adjusted his backpack, looked toward Shadow, then toward the girls. And deep down, one uncomfortable truth settled firmly into place. Whoever had hidden them here had not expected somebody stubborn enough to finally follow a dog that refused to walk away. The canyon felt smaller once they started moving. Smaller and somehow heavier. Snow drifted harder through the narrow path, while fading daylight turned the cliffs into shadows that seemed too close together. Daniel walked slightly ahead, flashlight low, eyes scanning every movement while Shadow stayed close beside Sophie. The German shepherd moved slower than usual now, constantly checking behind them, watching the canyon entrance the way soldiers check doors after hearing something they could not explain. Emily stayed close to Daniel, but kept glancing over her shoulder. Nervous, listening, waiting for something she clearly feared more than cold or darkness. How far? Daniel asked gently while helping Sophie step over loose rocks. Emily hesitated. The road is not safe, she whispered quietly. He watches it sometimes. Daniel frowned slightly. Watches it. Not checked. Not visits. Watches. The word mattered. People revealed truth without meaning to when fear shaped their language. Daniel slowed near a narrow turn between cliffs and crouched slightly beside Emily. I need you to tell me something, he said calmly. Who is he? Emily looked away immediately. Same reaction every time. Fear first. Silence second. He said nobody would believe us, she whispered. Daniel kept his voice steady. That is not true. Emily shook her head. People stopped looking. Daniel did not answer right away, because painful things felt different when spoken by someone young enough to still count years by birthdays. For winters. For birthdays gone. For years learning survival instead of childhood. Snow crunched softly beneath boots while cold wind carried through the canyon in long, low waves. Sophie suddenly stopped walking. Daniel turned immediately. You okay? She nodded once, but pointed quietly toward Shadow. The dog had frozen again. Same posture as the first day. Ears forward. Body still. Watching something farther up the trail. Daniel's instincts tightened instantly. Stay behind me, he said quietly. No panic. Just calm instruction. Shadow remained silent, which somehow felt more serious than barking ever could. The German shepherd stared toward a higher ridge overlooking part of the canyon path. Nothing visible at first. Just snow moving through wind. Then movement. Brief. Fast. A shadow crossing higher rocks before disappearing. Daniel narrowed his eyes immediately. Human? Maybe. Hard to tell in low light. Too distant for certainty. Yet the timing felt wrong. Somebody moving through this weather out here? Not coincidence. Emily immediately looked terrified. He is here, she whispered softly. Daniel turned toward her carefully. Did you see him? She shook her head quickly. Sometimes he watches before coming. Daniel exhaled slowly through the cold air. No panic. Think first. React second. Years of training returned quietly, like old muscle memory buried beneath ordinary life. Protect first. Move smart. Avoid unnecessary risk. He checked his phone again. 1 week bar. Barely anything, but enough hope to matter. Daniel moved farther along the canyon wall and lifted the phone higher. Nothing. Then briefly. One signal line. Weak but there. He quickly typed a short emergency text to the Cedar Ridge Sheriff Office listed online earlier that week. Found 2 missing girls alive near Raven Canyon. Need assistance. Possible danger nearby. Sending location if possible. The message failed once. Twice. Then finally sent halfway through before freezing. Not perfect. Better than nothing. Daniel looked toward Shadow again. The German shepherd still watched the ridge. Waiting. Listening. Then Sophie quietly reached for Daniel's sleeve. He does not like loud trucks, she whispered. Daniel paused. Who? Sophie lowered her eyes. Mr. Grayson. Emily immediately stiffened beside her. Too late. The name already escaped. Daniel stayed calm even though every instinct sharpened instantly. Mr. Grayson? He repeated softly. Emily looked upset. Frightened. Like a rule had been broken. We should not say his name, she whispered. Daniel searched memory quickly. Grayson. Why did that sound familiar? Then suddenly it clicked. The diner wall. Search volunteers listed beneath old newspaper clippings. Harold Grayson. Local volunteer coordinator. Former wilderness guide. One of the people who helped search for the girls years ago. Daniel stopped walking completely. No chance. The same man helping organize search efforts could not also be the person hiding them. Yet something about it fit too perfectly. Too ugly to ignore. Emily quietly added something else. He said people out there stopped caring. Her voice shook slightly. He said nobody wanted us anymore. Daniel looked at her for a long moment before speaking carefully. Emily, he said gently. Sometimes bad people lie because truth scares them. Snow continued falling around them, while canyon shadows darkened deeper. Somewhere above, faint movement echoed again through the rocks. Too close now. Daniel looked toward the narrowing path ahead. Cabin still over an hour away in weather like this. Too far before dark. Too dangerous if someone followed. Then he noticed something farther ahead. Small ranger supply shelter near the old trail overlook. Locked most winters, but maybe enough cover for one night. Daniel pointed carefully. We are changing plans, he said quietly. We stay safe first. Shadow moved immediately once Daniel started walking again, but not before glancing back one final time toward the ridge. Watching, waiting, like he knew somebody had already been following them longer than Daniel wanted to admit. And deep beneath the growing storm, one terrible thought settled quietly into Daniel's mind. If Harold Grayson really had hidden these girls for 4 years, then somewhere out there, the one person the whole town trusted most might already be searching for what he had lost. The ranger shelter looked smaller than Daniel remembered, half buried beneath drifting snow, weathered wood barely standing against years of Colorado winters. But right now, small was enough. Safe was enough. Survival rarely cared about comfort. Daniel pushed open the stiff metal door and motioned carefully for Emily and Sophie to step inside first. Shadow entered last, stopping briefly near the doorway, ears forward, watching the canyon one final time before settling just inside. The room smelled like cold wood and dust. Old emergency blankets stacked in a corner. Small propane heater disconnected long ago. One cracked window facing the canyon trail. Better than open snow. Better than exposure. Daniel shut the door quietly behind them while wind rattled softly against the walls outside. Sophie immediately sat close beside Shadow again, fingers resting gently against his fur like she still needed proof he was real. Emily stayed standing, nervous, listening, always listening, like silence itself had taught her fear. Daniel unzipped his backpack and placed protein bars, bottled water, and spare thermal blankets onto an old wooden table. Not much, he said gently, but enough for tonight. Emily hesitated before finally stepping closer. Hunger won quietly over caution. Sophie looked uncertain until Shadow calmly lowered himself beside the blankets. Somehow the dog made everything feel less frightening. Daniel noticed it every time. Trust arrived easier through kindness than explanation. Snow tapped softly against the shelter windows while darkness slowly settled across the canyon outside. Daniel checked his phone again. One weak signal line flashed briefly before disappearing, then suddenly returned. Weak, unstable, but enough. He stepped near the cracked window and quickly dialed the Cedar Ridge Sheriff's Office. Static, ringing. Then finally, a tired voice answered. Sheriff's Office. Daniel exhaled quietly. My name is Daniel Hayes, he said quickly. I found the Parker girls. Silence. Complete silence. Then the dispatcher spoke again, slower this time. Sir. Daniel lowered his voice instinctively. Emily Parker and Sophie Parker. Alive. Near Raven Canyon. Another pause. Longer now. Then movement in the background. Voices. Confusion. Stay where you are, the dispatcher said carefully. Deputies are on the way. Daniel looked toward the dark canyon outside. Send Sheriff Collins, he added quietly. And do not announce this publicly yet. Why? The dispatcher asked. Daniel hesitated. Because I think somebody local knew where these girls were. Silence again. Then finally, understood. The line dropped immediately afterward. No signal left. Daniel slipped the phone back into his jacket. Emily stood watching him carefully. Suspicious still. You called them, she whispered quietly. Daniel nodded once. Help is coming. Her expression changed instantly. Fear. Real fear. No, she whispered. He said police cannot help. Daniel crouched slightly, so he was closer to eye level. Emily, he said gently, sometimes people say scary things because they want control. She looked uncertain, torn between fear and hope. Dangerous space to live inside. Sophie quietly leaned against Shadow, eyes growing heavier now. Exhaustion finally catching up. For years surviving had not taught them rest. Daniel could see that much already. Small reactions. Nervous glances. Listening to every sound. Trauma did not always scream. Sometimes it whispered through habits people never noticed. Then suddenly Shadow stood up. Instantly alert. Head lifted toward the window. Silent. Focused. Daniel turned immediately. Outside, Faint headlights moved through falling snow farther down the canyon road. Too early for deputies. Too quiet. Too slow. His stomach tightened. "Stay back," he said calmly. Emily froze completely. "He found us," she whispered. Daniel moved toward the window carefully. Through snow and darkness, he could barely make out the shape of an older pickup truck crawling slowly near the canyon trail. Then it stopped. No lights. No movement for several seconds. Too deliberate. Too familiar. Shadow remained silent near the door, muscles tense beneath his coat. Watching. Waiting. Daniel recognized that posture. Protective mode. The kind Shadow used overseas before danger arrived. A flashlight beam suddenly moved through the trees outside. Slow. Searching. Emily immediately stepped backward, breathing harder. Sophie grabbed Shadow tightly. "Do not let him take us," she whispered softly. Those words landed harder than Daniel expected. Because children should never have to say things like that. Daniel crouched near both girls immediately. Voice calm. Steady. "Nobody is taking you anywhere," he said quietly. "Not tonight." Outside, the flashlight moved closer. Slow footsteps crunching softly through fresh snow. Then a voice called faintly through the storm. Calm. Familiar. Older. "Emily." Pause. "Sophie." Daniel froze. Friendly tone. Too friendly. The kind of voice built on trust. Then Emily whispered something that made the entire room suddenly feel colder. "That is Mr. Grayson." Shadow moved immediately toward the door, standing between the girls and the sound outside. Silent. Protective. Watching. And somewhere deep beneath the storm, Daniel realized the entire town had spent 4 years trusting the same man, now standing outside the shelter asking the missing girls to come back. Daniel stood perfectly still near the shelter door while snow tapped softly against the window behind him. Outside, the flashlight beam moved slowly across the trees again. Patient. Familiar. Like somebody who had done this many times before. "Emily." The older voice called gently through the storm. "Sophie? It is freezing out here." Sophie moved closer to Shadow instantly. Small fingers gripping the thick fur near his neck while the German shepherd stood unmoving between the girls and the door. Silent. Focused. Protective. Daniel recognized the posture immediately. Shadow was not preparing for panic. He was preparing for protection. Big difference. Emily looked pale beneath the weak lantern light. "He sounds nice," Daniel said quietly, keeping his voice calm. "But I need you to tell me the truth." Emily swallowed hard. "He always sounds nice," she whispered. Those words settled heavily in the room. Because fear rarely looked dramatic. Sometimes fear were kindness. Familiarity. Routine. Daniel nodded once, slow and steady. "Okay," he said gently. "Then you stay behind me." Outside, footsteps crunched closer through fresh snow. Then stopped just beyond the shelter wall. "Girls," the voice called again, softer now. "You should not be out here alone." Daniel moved toward the cracked window carefully and finally saw him clearly. Older man. Late 60s maybe. Heavy winter coat. Gray beard dusted with snow. Flashlight in one hand. Familiar face from old newspaper clippings inside the diner. Harold Grayson. Trusted volunteer. Wilderness guide. The man who helped search for the missing girls years ago. Daniel felt something cold settle quietly in his chest. Not fear. Clarity. Sometimes the hardest truths were the safest faces. "I know somebody is inside," Harold called calmly. "Those girls belong with family." Daniel frowned slightly at the wording. Not should be with family. Belong with family. Strange choice. Controlled choice. He looked back toward Emily. "Did he ever hurt you?" Emily hesitated for a long moment before quietly shaking her head. "No," she whispered. "But he said bad things happen if we leave." Daniel nodded slowly. Control through fear. Isolation. Lies. Enough to trap children without chains. Outside, headlights suddenly appeared farther down the canyon trail. Different vehicle this time. Then another. Blue emergency lights flickered faintly through the falling snow. "Sheriff finally." Daniel exhaled quietly. Perfect timing. Harold noticed too. His flashlight shifted sharply toward the road. Small pause. Tiny reaction. But enough. Calm cracked for half a second. Then came movement outside. Fast footsteps retreating through snow. Daniel immediately opened the shelter door. Cold air rushed inside, while Shadow moved forward beside him. Not aggressive. Alert. Watching Harold disappear into the storm toward his truck farther down the trail. Seconds later, Sheriff vehicles rolled into view through the canyon entrance, lights flashing softly against snow-covered cliffs. Sheriff Collins stepped out first, heavy coat zipped high against the wind. Expression confused until Daniel pointed quietly toward Emily and Sophie, standing near Shadow inside the shelter. Everything changed after that. Silence first. Shock second. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. Because impossible things took time to understand. 2 missing girls. For years gone. Alive. Sheriff Collins lowered himself slowly near the doorway. Voice careful. Gentle. Emily, he asked quietly. Emily looked uncertain before nodding once. Collins looked away immediately for a second, emotional in the quiet way older people sometimes became when hope returned unexpectedly. We never stopped hoping, he said softly. Emily looked confused by that. Understandably confused. Hope felt different after abandonment. Over the next several days, Cedar Ridge changed completely. News spread fast. Faster than winter storms. Search files reopened. Questions followed. Quiet truths surfaced. Harold Grayson had isolated the girls after convincing them the world forgot them. Authorities later uncovered years of hidden manipulation and secrecy surrounding the canyon shelter. No dramatic headlines could explain the sadness of what happened, or the relief of what survived. Yet strangely, the loudest story in town was never really about Harold. It became about the dog. The German shepherd who refused to leave the canyon. The one creature who somehow knew something remained unfinished. Weeks later, after doctors, counselors, warm meals, and careful healing slowly began, Daniel sat outside his cabin watching winter sunlight stretch across fresh snow. Shadow rested quietly beside him like nothing extraordinary had ever happened. Just another ordinary afternoon. Sophie and Emily visited often now. Slowly, carefully. Healing took time. Trust even longer. But one afternoon, while snow melted gently from the pine branches overhead, Sophie sat beside Shadow and quietly wrapped her arms around his neck again. Same way she had inside the canyon. Then she looked toward Daniel with a small smile that finally looked like childhood returning. Everybody stopped looking, she whispered softly, then gently scratched behind Shadow's ears. Except him. Daniel looked at the German shepherd resting peacefully in the sunlight and smiled quietly to himself. Funny thing about loyalty. Sometimes the one who refuses to walk away becomes the reason somebody finally finds their way home.